What if the one place you've spent your life running from is the only place you can truly heal? The coastal wind whipped Sarah's hair as she stood before the weathered hospital building. Her fingers tightened around the strap of her bag, knuckles white with apprehension. This was it, her fresh start. "You've got this," she whispered to herself, her voice barely audible above the crashing waves nearby. As Sarah pushed through the heavy doors, the sterile scent of disinfectant replaced the salty air. The bustling corridor seemed to pause for a moment, curious eyes turning to assess the newcomer. Sarah straightened her back, chin held high, yet beneath her confident exterior, a familiar ache of not belonging threatened to surface. "You must be Sarah Harper," a crisp voice cut through her thoughts. Sarah turned to face a stern-looking woman in a pristine white coat. "Dr. Davis, Chief of Medicine," the woman introduced herself, her handshake firm and impersonal. "Nice to meet you, Dr. Davis. I'm looking forward to starting here," Sarah replied, forcing a smile. Dr. Davis's eyes narrowed slightly. "We'll see. Follow me." As they walked, Sarah's mind drifted to the argument that had driven her here. The last conversation with her father before. "Focus," she chided herself silently, pushing the memory away. The tour was a blur of introductions and protocols. Sarah nodded along, acutely aware of the sideways glances and hushed whispers that followed in her wake. "And this is where you'll be stationed," Dr. Davis gestured to a busy nurse's station. "Any questions?" Sarah opened her mouth to speak, but Dr. Davis had already turned away, leaving her alone in the whirlwind of activity. Taking a deep breath, Sarah approached the desk. "Hi, I'm Sarah, the new nurse." The chatter died down. A few nods, a couple of tight smiles, but no warm welcomes. "Right," an older nurse said, not looking up from her chart. "There's a stack of files that need processing. Get started on those." Sarah nodded, swallowing her disappointment. This wasn't quite the fresh start she'd envisioned. As she settled into the monotonous task, a commotion from down the hall caught her attention. "Code Blue in room 205, a voice called out. Without hesitation, Sarah sprung into action. Her feet carried her swiftly down the corridor, muscle memory from years of training taking over. She burst into the room, quickly assessing the situation. An elderly man lay motionless on the bed, the monitor beside him flatlining. Sarah moved to start compressions, but a hand on her shoulder stopped her. "We've got this," Dr. Davis said coldly. "You're not familiar with our protocols yet. Step aside." Helpless, Sarah watched as the team worked to revive the patient. Her hands itched to help, her mind racing with possible interventions. After what felt like an eternity, a weak beep emanated from the monitor. The crisis had passed. As the team dispersed, Sarah's eyes met those of the patient. Despite his ordeal, there was a glimmer of something: recognition? Understanding. In his gaze. "Thank you," he wheezed, his voice barely audible. Sarah smiled, warmth spreading through her chest. "I'm Sarah. I'll be one of your nurses." The old man's lips curved into a weak smile. James Walker." He replied. "People like us, we never stay long here." Sarah's brow furrowed in confusion. "I'm sorry." But James had already drifted off to sleep, leaving Sarah to ponder his cryptic words. As she left the room, she caught Dr. Davis watching her with an unreadable expression. "Harper," she called out. "My office. Now." Sarah's heart sank. What had she done wrong? As she followed Dr. Davis, James's words echoed in her mind. "People like us, we never stay long here." What did he mean? And why did those words fill her with both dread and hope? Sarah's footsteps echoed in the empty corridor as she followed Dr. Davis. Her heart raced, mind replaying every moment since her arrival. What had she done wrong? The office door clicked shut behind them. Dr. Davis's stern gaze fixed on Sarah. "Ms. Harper," she began, her voice crisp, "I understand you're eager to prove yourself. But rushing into situations without understanding our protocols is dangerous." Sarah's cheeks flushed. "I'm sorry, Dr. Davis. I just wanted to help." "Your enthusiasm is noted," Dr. Davis replied, her tone softening slightly. "But remember, this isn't the big city. We do things differently here." Sarah nodded, swallowing the lump in her throat. It won't happen again. As she left the office, Sarah's father's words echoed in her mind. You always rush in without thinking, Sarah. She shook her head, trying to dispel the memory. The weight of unresolved guilt pressed heavily on her shoulders. Days blurred together. Sarah threw herself into her work, determined to prove her worth. Yet, the subtle exclusion from her colleagues persisted. Lunch breaks spent alone. Conversations that stopped when she approached. It was high school all over again. One quiet afternoon, Sarah found herself by James Walker's bedside. The old man's eyes crinkled with a smile as she entered. Ah, the new girl, he rasped. Still here, I see. Sarah smiled, checking his vitals. Just doing my job, Mr. Walker. James chuckled, the sound like gravel. Call me James. And it's more than that. I can tell. Sarah paused, meeting his knowing gaze. What do you mean? You're running from something, James said softly. Just like I did. Sarah's hands trembled slightly. She busied herself with adjusting James's pillows. Want to know a secret? James whispered. The sea was always a better friend than people. Sarah's brow furrowed. You were a sailor? James nodded, his eyes distant. Saw the world, but the waves, they understood me better than anyone ever did. A comfortable silence fell between them. Sarah found herself opening up. I thought coming here would be a fresh start, she admitted. But the past has a way of catching up, James finished. His weathered hand patted hers gently. Sarah nodded, surprised at the tears pricking her eyes. Give it time, James advised. The tide always turns. As Sarah left James's room, a sense of calm settled over her. For the first time since arriving, she felt a glimmer of hope. That hope was short-lived. Harper, Dr. Davis's voice cut through the air. We have a situation. Sarah hurried to the emergency room. A young man thrashed on the gurney, his eyes wild with pain. Severe allergic reaction, a nurse reported. Bepe draping. Sarah moved to help, but Dr. Davis stepped in front of her. Observe only, Harper. This is a delicate case. Frustration bubbled in Sarah's chest. She watched, helpless as the team worked. Suddenly, the patient's breathing hitched. The monitor screamed a warning. Without thinking, Sarah grabbed the epinephrine. He needs a higher dose, she called out. Dr. Davis whirled around, eyes flashing. Harper, stand down. But Sarah had already administered the injection. Time seemed to stand still. Then, the patient's breathing evened out. The monitors stabilized. Relief washed over Sarah. She'd done it. She'd saved him. But the cold fury in Dr. Davis's eyes told a different story. My office. Now. The words cut like ice. As Sarah followed Dr. Davis, dread pooled in her stomach. She'd crossed a line. Would this mistake cost her everything? Her phone buzzed in her pocket. A text from an unknown number. Sarah glanced at it quickly. Her blood ran cold. Mom in hospital. It's bad. Come home now. Sarah froze, torn between two impossible choices. Stay and face the consequences of her actions, or rush to her mother's side, abandoning the fresh start she'd fought so hard for. Dr. Davis's office door loomed before her. A crossroads. Which path would she choose? And at what cost? Sarah's hand hovered over the door handle to Dr. Davis's office. The weight of her phone in her pocket felt like an anchor. Her mother's condition, or her career. She closed her eyes, took a deep breath and stepped inside. Dr. Davis looked up, her expression unreadable. Sit down, Harper. Sarah perched on the edge of the chair, her heart pounding. Your actions today were reckless, Dr. Davis began, her voice low and controlled. You endangered a patient's life. But I saved him, Sarah protested weakly. Dr. Davis's eyes flashed. This time. But your cowboy antics have no place here. This is your final warning. The words hung in the air, heavy with finality. Sarah nodded, swallowing hard. I understand. As she left the office, Sarah's phone buzzed again. She ignored it, guilt gnawing at her insides. The corridors seemed longer, the air thicker. Sarah found herself at James's door, drawn by an unseen force. James was awake, his eyes knowing. Rough day. Sarah sank into the chair by his bed, her shoulders sagging. You could say that. Want to talk about it? James offered, his voice gentle. Sarah shook her head, then paused. Have you ever felt like, no matter what you do, you're letting someone down? James chuckled softly. Only every day of my life. He shifted in his bed, wincing slightly. I had a son once. Lost him at sea. Sarah's eyes widened. I'm so sorry. James waved a hand dismissively. It was a long time ago. But you know what I learned? Sarah leaned in, curious. Life's not about avoiding the storms, James said, his eyes distant. It's about learning to dance in the rain. The words settled in Sarah's chest, a warm glow amidst the turmoil. Days passed. Sarah threw herself into her work, determined to prove herself. But the distance between her and her colleagues seemed to grow. Whispers followed her. Sidelong glances. The weight of judgment pressing down. One evening, after a particularly grueling shift, Sarah found herself on the beach. The wind whipped around her, mirroring the storm inside. She thought of her father, of their last argument, how he died before she could make things right. And now her mother. Was history repeating itself? Sarah's phone felt heavy in her hand. She should call. She should go home. But something held her back. Fear. Pride. Or something deeper. The waves crashed against the shore, relentless, like the memories that haunted her. Suddenly, a flash of light caught her attention. Squinting against the wind, Sarah saw a figure on the cliffside. Her heart lurched. It was James. Without thinking, Sarah broke into a run. Sand flew beneath her feet as she raced towards the cliff. James! She called out, her voice lost in the howling wind. As she drew closer, she could make out his frail form, standing precariously close to the edge. Panic gripped her. Was he going to jump? James! She cried out again, desperation clawing at her throat. He turned slowly, his eyes meeting hers. In that moment, Sarah saw a reflection of her own pain, her own loneliness. She reached out a hand. Please, step back. James smiled sadly. Ah, Sarah, always trying to save everyone. The wind roared around them, drowning out the world. But who's going to save you? James asked, his voice barely audible above the storm. Sarah froze, the words hitting her like a physical blow. In that moment, perched on the edge of the cliff, Sarah felt her carefully constructed walls begin to crumble. The storm outside paled in comparison to the one raging within. As she stood there, hand outstretched to James, Sarah realized she was at a crossroads. Save James, or finally face the truth she'd been running from all along. The wind howled, the waves crashed, and Sarah's world teetered on the brink of change. What choice would she make? And could she live with the consequences? The wind whipped Sarah's hair as she stood, hand outstretched, on the edge of the cliff. James's words echoed in her mind. Who's going to save you? Time seemed to stand still. The roaring of the waves below faded to a whisper. Sarah took a step forward, her voice barely audible. James, please. The old man's eyes softened. He reached out, grasping Sarah's hand. As they moved away from the edge, Sarah felt something inside her shift. A dam breaking. They sat on a nearby bench, the storm around them mirroring Sarah's internal turmoil. I wasn't going to jump, James said quietly. This is where I come to think. Sarah nodded, unable to speak. The lump in her throat threatened to choke her. You carry a heavy burden, James observed. I recognize it. I've carried it too. Sarah looked at him, really looked at him for the first time. She saw the weight of years of loss, etched in the lines of his face. I lost my son, James continued, his voice thick with emotion. And for years I blamed myself. Sarah's breath caught. She thought of her father, of their unresolved argument. But you know what I learned? James asked, his eyes meeting hers. Guilt is a prison we build for ourselves. The words hit Sarah like a physical blow. Tears she'd held back for so long finally spilled over. James placed a weathered hand on her shoulder. It's time to set yourself free, Sarah. In that moment, perched on the edge of the world, Sarah felt something begin to heal. The storm around them began to subside, as if nature itself recognized the significance of the moment. Suddenly, Sarah's pager buzzed. Reality crashed back in. "Emergency at the hospital," she explained, wiping her eyes. "I have to go." James nodded, understanding in his gaze. "Remember, Sarah, you can't save everyone, but that doesn't mean you should stop trying." With a final, grateful smile, Sarah turned and ran. Her feet carried her swiftly back to the hospital. The emergency room was chaos. A multi-car pileup had left several critically injured. Sarah dove in, her earlier emotional turmoil giving way to focused determination. She moved from patient to patient, her hands steady, her mind clear. In the midst of the frenzy, she caught Dr. Davis watching her. The older woman's expression unreadable. Hours passed in a blur of activity. Sarah worked tirelessly, drawing on every ounce of her training and experience. As the last patient was stabilized, a hush fell over the ER. Dr. Davis approached Sarah, her face grave. "Harper, a word." Sarah braced herself, expecting another reprimand. But Dr. Davis's next words took her by surprise. "That was impressive work tonight." Sarah blinked, unsure she'd heard correctly. "You showed real skill under pressure," Dr. Davis continued. "Perhaps I've been too harsh in my judgment." A glimmer of hope sparked in Sarah's chest. But before she could respond, a nurse burst into the room. "Dr. Davis, it's the patient in room 205. He's coding." Sarah's heart dropped. "Room 205, James." Without thinking, she sprinted down the hall, Dr. Davis close behind. They burst into the room to find James convulsing on the bed, the monitors screaming. Sarah moved to help, but Dr. Davis held her back. "This is beyond your expertise, Harper." But as Sarah watched the team work, something nagged at her. A detail from James's chart. She knew what to do, but after everything, could she risk it? The monitors continued to wail, James's life hanging in the balance. Sarah stood frozen, torn between protocol and instinct, between fear and courage. In that moment, she heard James's voice in her head. "It's time to set yourself free." Sarah took a deep breath and made her choice. What would she do? And would it be enough to save James? Or would this be the mistake that finally cost her everything? Time seemed to slow as Sarah stepped forward. Her voice rang out, clear and confident. "He needs potassium. Now!" Dr. Davis's head snapped up, eyes narrowing. "Harper, I warned you." But Sarah stood her ground. "Trust me. Please." A heartbeat of silence. Then Dr. Davis nodded curtly. "Do it." Sarah's hands moved swiftly, administering the medication. The room held its breath. Beep, beep, beep. James's heart rate steadied. The monitors quieted. Relief washed over Sarah. She'd done it. Dr. Davis's voice cut through the silence. "Everyone out. Except you, Harper." As the room emptied, Sarah braced herself. This was it, the end of her career. But Dr. Davis's next words surprised her. "How did you know?" Sarah explained her observation from James's chart, her voice steady, professional. Dr. Davis listened, her expression unreadable. Finally, she spoke. "Good catch, Harper. You may have saved his life." The words hung in the air, a moment of validation Sarah had longed for. But before she could respond, a nurse appeared at the door. "Dr. Davis, there's an urgent call for Nurse Harper." Sarah's heart sank. Her mother. With a nod from Dr. Davis, Sarah rushed to the phone, her hands trembling as she answered. "Sarah!" Her sister's voice crackled through the line. "Mom's stable, but there's something you need to see." Relief and confusion warred within Sarah. "What is it?" "A letter. From Dad." The world seemed to tilt on its axis. Hours later, Sarah sat in the quiet of the on-call room, the letter clutched in her hands. With a deep breath, she began to read. "My dearest Sarah, if you're reading this, I'm gone, and I fear I've left too much unsaid. I know we parted on bitter terms. My pride and your stubbornness. A combination as volatile as any medical emergency. But I need you to know, I was wrong. Sarah's breath caught. Tears blurred her vision. You were right to challenge me, to push for better treatments. It's what I taught you after all. I was afraid of change, afraid of admitting that my little girl had grown into a brilliant nurse. But most of all, I was afraid of losing you. I've always been an outsider, Sarah, never quite fitting in. Sound familiar? It's a burden we share, but it's also our greatest strength. Don't let the world dim your light, your passion. It's what makes you extraordinary. I'm sorry I couldn't tell you this in person, but know that I always have been, so very proud of you. Love, Dad. Sarah's tears fell freely now, years of guilt and pain washing away. A soft knock at the door startled her. James stood there, leaning on an enforced stand. You should be resting, Sarah admonished gently. James smiled. I had to thank my savior. Sarah shook her head. I just did my job. No, James said firmly. You did more than that. You trusted yourself. Sarah looked down at the letter in her hands. I had a good teacher. James nodded, understanding in his eyes. So, what now? Sarah took a deep breath, the weight of decision settling on her shoulders. I think it's time I went home. James's smile was bittersweet. Ah, the prodigal daughter returns. Sarah felt a pang of guilt. But what about you? James waved a hand dismissively. Oh, I'll be fine. But Sarah, she looked at him, questioning. Remember, home isn't always a place. As Sarah pondered his words, her phone buzzed. A text from Dr. Davis. My office. First thing tomorrow. Sarah's heart raced. What did it mean? She looked at James, then back at her phone. Two paths stretching before her. The letter from her father, the unfinished business at home, and now, a potential turning point in her career. Sarah stood at a crossroads, each choice carrying the weight of her past and the promise of her future. What would she choose? And could she find a way to honor both her father's memory and her own dreams? The morning sun painted the hospital corridors in hues of gold. Sarah stood outside Dr. Davis's office, her father's letter tucked safely in her pocket. She took a deep breath, knocked once, and entered. Dr. Davis looked up, her expression unreadable. Sit down, Harper. Sarah perched on the edge of the chair, heart racing. I've been reviewing your performance, Dr. Davis began, and I've come to a decision. Sarah held her breath. This was it. I'd like to offer you a permanent position here, Dr. Davis said, her tone softer than Sarah had ever heard it. Sarah blinked, stunned. I thank you, Dr. Davis. But as the words left her mouth, Sarah felt a strange hollowness. Dr. Davis tilted her head, studying Sarah. You don't seem as excited as I expected. Sarah's hand unconsciously moved to her pocket, feeling the outline of her father's letter. I need some time to think, Sarah said quietly. Dr. Davis nodded, understanding in her eyes. Take the day. Let me know your decision tomorrow. Sarah left the office in a daze. Her feet carried her to James's room, but the bed was empty. A nurse passing by noticed her confusion. Mr. Walker checked himself out this morning, she explained. Said he had one last journey to make. Sarah's heart sank. She'd missed her chance to say goodbye. Drawn by an unseen force, Sarah found herself on the beach, the same spot where she'd stood with James just days ago. The sea stretched out before her, endless and inviting. Sarah closed her eyes, letting the sound of the waves wash over her. In that moment, she heard her father's voice, saw James's knowing smile, felt Dr. Davis's unexpected kindness. Home isn't always a place, James had said. Sarah opened her eyes, a sense of clarity washing over her. She pulled out her phone, dialing a number she knew by heart. Mom, she said, her voice thick with emotion. I'm coming home. As Sarah packed her few belongings, a note slipped under her door caught her attention. In James's shaky handwriting, it read, Dear Sarah, by the time you read this, I'll be on my way. The sea calls, and this old sailor must answer. But before I go, I wanted to thank you, not just for saving my life, but for reminding me what it means to truly live. You have a gift, Sarah, not just for medicine, but for healing souls. Don't be afraid to let your light shine. The world needs more people like you. Remember, life is about the choices we make and the courage to live with them. Fair winds and following seas. James. Tears blurred Sarah's vision. She clutched the note to her chest, feeling a mix of sadness and gratitude. As she stepped out of the hospital for the last time, Sarah paused. She looked back at the building that had been the stage for her journey of self-discovery. Then she turned to face the road ahead, her path clear for the first time in years. The drive home was long, giving Sarah time to reflect on her father's words, on James's wisdom, on the lessons she'd learned. As she pulled into her childhood driveway, Sarah felt a sense of peace settle over her. Her mother stood on the porch, arms open wide. Sarah rushed into her embrace, years of misunderstanding melting away. "I'm sorry," Sarah whispered, "for everything." Her mother held her tight. "Welcome home, sweetheart." As they walked inside, Sarah's phone buzzed. A text from Dr. Davis. "The door is always open. When you're ready." Sarah smiled, realizing that sometimes going back is the only way to move forward. She looked around the familiar living room, at her mother's loving face, at the photos of her father. This was where she needed to be, for now. But a part of her knew that this wasn't the end of her journey, merely a new beginning. As Sarah settled in, helping her mother and reconnecting with her past, she felt a stirring in her heart, a call to something greater, a purpose yet to be fulfilled. The sea stretched out beyond the horizon, full of possibilities. And Sarah knew that someday, when the time was right, she would answer that call. But for now, she was home. The phone on the table buzzed again. An unknown number. Sarah hesitated, then picked up. "Hello." A familiar voice crackled through. "Sarah? It's James. I need your help." Sarah's heart raced. What new adventure awaited? And was she ready to embark on it? Thanks so much for watching. If this story touched your heart, make sure to hit that like button. Every thumbs up helps more people discover these narratives. Don't forget to subscribe for more powerful stories that inspire, and share this video with someone who could use a reminder that healing starts with facing the past. See you in the next one.